Hey guys, what's up? This is Nachos, and in this video we're going to look at a hand that I played versus player number 3 here. And player number 3 is one of the better players in Nachos CFP. He's playing 5-10 and 10-20 quite consistently, and yeah, he's just a very good player that always puts you in a lot of tough spots. In his hand, like, he's named villain number 3 because I want him to be anonymous, but he knows that I'm the big blind here. I know that he's player number 3. And so we know each other, and we're playing a hand of poker against one another. And right off the bat, he picks a, well, like I wanted to say uncommon, but at high stakes is actually a very common sizing. But if you're playing in less competitive environments, then this is definitely a less uncommon sizing, the overbet on the flop here. Although it's probably becoming more and more standard these days. The purpose of this bet is to leverage the fact that the in-position player has hands that the out-of-position player doesn't have. So the in-position player has more ace-jack, more jack-10, more overpairs, or like is the only one that has overpairs. Pocket 10s, pocket jacks, and those are hands that the out-of-position player doesn't really have. The out-of-position player has hands like 10-7 suited, although 10-7 suited, like 6-5 offsuit, because he went with a small opening. So like a lot of like lower pairs and middle pairs are going to be more common in the out-of-position player's range, and then the in-position player range consists of more of these stronger hands. So in other words, the in-position player has an advantage in the top of the range, and therefore wants to go polar on a board like this to force hands like mine into indifference. So what he's actually doing is he's picking the bet size that is optimal for hands like pocket queens, for instance. And so they try to squeeze out the maximum versus ace-10. Should he have gone for a 2x overbet, then I'm always going to be able to fold my random 10x, or mostly I'm able to fold my random 10x. And if he goes for, let's say, half pot or 1/3 here, then he's not making enough with his overpairs. Now, if you are range betting here, that is not necessarily a mistake, right? Like, it is a minor mistake. It's an inefficiency. I think you're losing about 1.5 to 2% of the pot, maybe a little bit more, definitely not more than 2% of the pot. If you are just beginning, like if you're just starting out in poker and you're just trying to get a hold of everything, or even if you're just like relatively good, but there's still like a lot of other things that you can fixate on, like defending or some second barrel spots or whatever, then going for a range bet here is a very plausible option. Now, my opponent goes for the overbet for 2 reasons, I think. One is he's well studied and he's able to capture more EV, or he thinks he's able to capture more EV than he would with the range bet. And the other reason is he is well studied and therefore might even over realize his EV, in the sense that he might just know this part of the game sheet better than, in this case, I do, and therefore will likely be able to exploit me in some nodes that are very complex to play. And because the moment that he overbets here, there's going to be, like, the game tree is twice as large, because he doesn't have just one sizing, he has one strategical option, which is range betting, but he has 2, a check and an overbet. In addition to that, as we'll see here, there's going to be plenty of turns where if I call, and this is a debatable call, as we'll see in a sim, now there's plenty of situations in which I need to develop a leading range. If I'm missing that already, I'm losing a gigantic amount of EV. And there's some other things that you definitely need to understand if you're opening, if you face the overbet here from the big blind's perspective. Anyway, like, I wanted to keep this intro brief and then just go into a sim, but here I'm rambling on. Overbet, we call. Like I said, this is a speculative call. I wasn't too sure, and I decided to roll and just roll like 25% calls, and I ended up calling here. However, I think I looked at the sim 2 weeks ago, when this hand was played, roughly 2 weeks ago. So yeah, like 1 week ago, and I think this was a fold or it was a very low frequency call. Regardless, we get the 6 of diamonds on the turn, and the 6 of diamonds is a very interesting turn. Generally speaking, on flush closing turns, you get to lead your entire range on the turn. And the reason is we have essentially all of the flushes that we have in our pre-flop range, as we are never folding a flush draw on the flop. But the in-position player is checking behind some flush draws, stuff like 4-5 suited, maybe 7-5 suited, stuff that doesn't really want to inflate the pot that much. It wants to obviously hit a flush, but it's sort of okay if the pot doesn't always go in once the flush rolls off. Those type of flush draws are checking back the flop a little bit more. And so the imposition range consists of some very strong hands, like flushes, although a little bit less. And then now a lot of hands that get devalued to effectively a bluff catcher. So think something like ace-jack, pocket queens, especially without a diamond. Obviously, those hands are cringing a little bit now because of the fact that the 6 pairs and in particular the diamond rolls off. So generally speaking, on flush closing turns, you are able to lead your entire range. And I'll show you in a sim how this works and yeah, like what the strategy and the ideas are behind it. The point here is that this is the 6 of diamonds, and so it's also a pairing turn. I'm not really going to have trips very often, although I'm calling some 10s like I do right here, and some 6s. Most of the 6s that I'm calling contain the 6 of diamonds, like all of the suited 6s, for instance, or at least one diamond. So I don't really make an awful lot of trips. Should I have sized smaller, like 3/4 of the pot, then I'm calling more 6s here, and then the 6 would actually benefit me quite a bit. In this case, the diamond is benefiting me. I think the pairing nature of this board kind of, yeah, counterfeits some of those benefits that I get for getting the flush closing turn here. So what ends up happening is I make a bunch of flushes, I'm really happy, but my opponent still has boats that I don't have. So the power of those flushes is diminished a little bit, and we'll see in a sim that I am supposed to lead here, but not to the same frequency as I would on, for instance, the 5 of diamonds. Anyway, I lead here, cool. And then on the river here, we have to make a decision. Are we going to bet or are we going to check? Well, the first question that you want to ask yourself is like, what would be the purpose of a bet here, right? Let's say we go all in. Does this make sense as a bluff? And I don't think it does. It has pretty bad removal on calling range on the river. Although, like, you could argue that the 10 blocks some bluff catchers for sure, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is your 10 is actually worth quite a bit of pot share here. So if we were supposed to check the turn, then there's a reasonable chance that our opponent is going to check back and we win, right? So checking is worth something. And because it's worth something, the bet needs to be worth more than the check. And in this case, I don't think that's the case. It might be different if we hold the ace of diamonds as well. I'm interested to see if that's a thing, but even then, I think it probably is not a thing. I think our 10 is just too strong. Value betting doesn't make too much sense either here because our opponent goes polar on the flop. So he chooses a big bet sizing, and what he's saying with that bet size is I have ace jack or better. Maybe some king jack is in there, maybe some queen jack, but mostly like I have a very strong top pair. And so he doesn't really have, on a texture like this, he doesn't really have hands that can call, right? There's no pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s. There's no 9-10. There's just not many pairs that can call. There's some ace king and ace queen that might call versus block bet, but mostly he has just hands that are like worse or better than mine. We have one option, and that is to check here, I think, with our hands, and then our opponent decides to go for this bet size, which is putting my hand into indifference. I think, again, and I discussed this with the player, and he thinks this as well. So I think what he needs to do is just go bigger here, and I think he needs to do that for 2 reasons. One is I am capped, and in practice, most players would be more capped than a sim would be here. And then secondly, like if you have pocket queens even versus a sim here, you are quite okay betting larger here, I think. Like let's say you have pocket queens or ace jack, like you shouldn't really be worried too much about the out of position player having a stronger hand. Now it is going to happen, right? Pocket 10s, for instance, for me would, I think, be an okay check. And then there's going to be some flushes that want to check here. But mostly I think I'm incentivized to just bet those, and therefore if I'm checking, I'm basically saying I have a hand roughly like I have, and or like queen jack type hand, or jack 8 or something like that. And so I think you want to value bet with a range that beats most checks, and then you want to go bigger. We'll see in a sim if that's correct, but I ended up calling. Again, a debatable call. I thought this would be indifferent, and then basically what ended up happening was I was thinking 2 things. One is like if there's a bluff in this guy's range, he's probably going to find it because he's really good. And then the other one is here on the turn, I expected the in-position player to have to call uncapped. So he needs to call, which is kind of counterintuitive versus a small bet like this. But he needs to call some flushes. He needs to call some boats even, I think. I will see in a sim if that's correct, but that was my perception of the spot. And so the moment that he calls here, and I think like very good player, but I think if he's going to make a mistake, it is likely something like that, where he might not protect his range enough. And then what ends up happening is that if you don't have the amount of flushes that you should in your calling turn range, then you don't have them here in your betting range. And so I ended up calling. I ended up getting lucky because this is just a bluff by the in-position player. But it's definitely an interesting hand, and we'll go into the sim and I'll show you a little bit how I think about the game and where I think both players could have gained some EV. Alright, so here we are with the sim. I built a relatively simple sim with one sizing for the in-position player, which I'm assuming is this player's strategy, and then a bunch of sizes on the turn, a bunch of raise sizes, and yeah, this should be relatively decent here. What we can see is, that like the betting range is, let's say, decent jack and better, right? Jack 9, Jack 8, Jack 7 are just checking mostly, and 10s are very rarely betting here, as you can see, maybe some at the back door, some at the diamond, but mostly it's just like queens plus, ace jack plus, roughly speaking, and then the sets are going to be betting quite often. So we face the overbet, and we can see here that my exact hand, which is ace of spades, and I rarely do this, like, but it's fun to see right now. Ace of spades, 10 of clubs. Do I have that one? Yeah, I'm lucky. I'm allowed to call, but obviously I'm not going to be able to figure this out in game. You generally just want to call when you have a diamond, as you can see here, and then in addition to that, like, probably you don't want to have hearts. So I can see like the ace of hearts not being great because like something like ace 5 of hearts is betting as the in-position player a bit more. Is it true? I rarely get caught up with like the actual suits unless it's like very common, like, okay, we want to have a diamond because diamond gives equity, or we want to have very specific unblockers to folding range or stuff like that, but this is kind of noisy. I don't think it matters too much. Anyway, like mostly we should just be folding. That's what I take away from this. Like the EVs are going to be relatively close. Yeah, so I make 1/100th of a chip. Just one chip is like 1/10 of a big blind. So this is like, if I let it run like for 3 more minutes, it might just be a fold. If you're in a wider formation, let's say we are button versus big blind, then this becomes a pure or near pure call, a high frequency call. But now we are in a tighter formation, and so like the concentration of like stuff like ace jack and hands that have a lot of equity here for the in-position players is a lot higher, and so we are just starting to fold hands like this a little bit more. Call, and then 6 of diamonds, and we can see there's no real, like there's a leading frequency, but realistically we are able to cut this out. Like if you have like 19% leads, roughly speaking, then you can just cut it out and you're not losing that much EV. What we'll be doing today is we're going to be playing around a little bit with this to see if we can come up with some strategies that go beyond just like looking at what the sim does and taking it for face value. But here you can see like on most flush closing turns, you can bet at a high frequency, and there's even some where you might be able to polarize. So I'm imagining like an ace of diamonds. We can actually do that. Put like the ace of diamonds here, and what we'll do is we'll create a subtree. So what we're basically doing here is we're saying from this point on, we're building a new sim, and I'm opening a new bio sim here. You can see like it starts at the turn now with the ranges that we have at the turn. And the reason to do this is 1, you don't need to node lock the flop, and 2, it just runs a lot quicker. So like because the game tree is very small, you just get an answer relatively quickly. Let's see if there's some, yeah, you can see here there's some big embedding now. You can actually lead for larger sizes. If this would be ace, king, queen, then you can lead for overbet sizes because you basically have a lot more flushes in the top of the range. Anyway, let's go back here. We are at the 6 of diamonds, and no, wait, one sec. Like, let's first go into the range run out. hotness chart. So do it like this. And then again, go for strategy. And you can see, like I said, we are going to be able to lead them all. And then the 6 of diamonds is like the lowest frequency leading one. And you can see why. Like all of the other ones are like green. Jacks are quite good. So on jacks, we get the lead as well, which is something that a lot of players are missing. The reason being, like, we just call all of our jacks basically on the flop. Maybe we fold a sliver, but mostly we just call them, and the in position player checks a bunch of the jacks because they're too weak to go for an overbet sizing. But the 6 of diamonds is an interesting card, as it's the one diamond that we probably can't range bet on. Now, one thing that you can do is you can say, okay, this may be true, create subtree, so 6 of diamonds, and now we are going to play around with this a little bit. So let's go for a range check, and we're going to open good old notepad. And we're going to play around with this a little bit. So let's say we cut it out completely, right? As opposed to having that 25% bet. Having that 25% bet in there is going to increase our EV. You can see it's very minimal. So we are losing 0.1 chip here, which is, in this case, is roughly 0.1% of the pot, percent difference as well. But another thing that we can do is we can say, okay, let's say we are going to bet 12% of the pot. I'm not saying we should be betting at all, right? Like, that's not the purpose. It's like trying to prove that my lead is right. But what I want to do is I want to find the simplification where I can say, okay, all the flush closing turns are range lead spots. If you want to play a simple strategy. If you're not sure, then sizing down might be an option. And then we go here, and now we get to like range leading territory. Let's make it 10% of the pot. And you can see it goes up quite a bit. Quite a bit is relative to what we've seen before. Let's just try the force a range bet here for the out of position player for 10% of the pot. And range betting 10% of the pot is still better than a range check or a bet 25 and check, right? So it's like basically the correct sizing, and we can just bet our entire range and be done with it. It would be roughly 2 big blinds. One way to look at this is you can check your entire range. You're not losing that much. You can bet your range and you're not losing, or actually gaining a little bit in this case. So even if your opponent is not making any mistakes in his side of the game tree, which is going to be a pretty complex thing to do, then still you are gaining a little bit of EV, right? This is, let's say, 0.25 chips. So it's like 2.5 big blinds per 100 hands, doing the math from the top of my head, so I could be wrong. Don't flame me in the comments if this turns out to be wrong, but it seems right. To reiterate, like, our strategy is not more complex now. Vidin's strategy is more complex because we are betting small and he needs to now construct like a calling, folding, and a raising range. But our strategy is as complex. We're, instead of checking our entire range, we're betting our entire range. Cool, so we found that out, and now we have the simplification. Flush closing turn, we are betting our entire range, and we pick a sizing between, let's say, 25% of the pot and 10% of the pot, or maybe even smaller if we are not sure. And in this case, in-game, I wasn't sure, but I thought, well, range betting can't be too bad. But probably I made like a slight EV mistakes, or like when you go for the sizing, might actually be more than slight. Like, you might be losing a fair bit here. Yeah, so you can see now I'm losing like 2 chips, which is, 0.2 big blinds is quite significant here. Assuming that my opponent is playing correctly, perfectly versus it, obviously. But he's not going to be playing perfectly versus all our strategies, I think. Even though he's a very good player. Okay, so here we are. I made a minor mistake. But what we're going to do is we're going to go with this strategy. So I'm betting my entire range for quarter pot. We might even go and play around with like betting range versus not betting range, and then see what our opponent needs to do here. So my presumption, if you remember, was that my opponent needs to call some very strong hands here, which is a little bit counterintuitive. If you have pocket tens here or something like that, and someone bets like 4.8 big blinds in the sim, in real life, it's actually a bit smaller because the pot is a bit smaller, but I bet quarter pot into my opponent, and you have pocket tens there. It's somewhat unintuitive, like pocket tens, pocket jacks, to click call, whereas what you probably want to do is just raise and get money into the pot. There's some other stuff as well, right? So if we go for, well, let's go here, and we will go for select all. So you can see the equity graph here. The out of position player just has such a massive advantage throughout the entire range here. Maybe not massive, but like a decent advantage. And like this on the top here is the difference between betting at a very high frequency for quarter pot and just betting at a high frequency for 10% of the pot, or betting at a low frequency for quarter pot. It's literally this little section. Having said that, like here we can see you need to call your flushes 61% of the time. My opponent is very well studied, and we should like give him the benefit of the doubt in this case. So I'm not saying he's going to miss that, right? That's not the point here. What we are saying is if he's missing something, then it's this. So we are always going to have to make assumptions, and the assumption here is that he might not find this entirely. Full house, he might not find this entirely, all these trips. Let's see, trips is raising, okay, cool. He just has 1.1 combo of trips though, so it doesn't really happen very often. Overpairs, calling mostly. So you can see like the top of your range just needs to call very, very often. And then you need to make some unintuitive raises with like second pair, which I'm not sure anyone is going to find. And then there is going to be like a bunch of like draws that should be raising. And we can see that the hand that our opponent had in the hand here, that's a hand that needs to be raising quite frequently as well. I talked with him about the hand, and he said that in-game he thought that his outs would be a bit too tainted to raise, which I think is kind of similar to how I thought that my range might be a bit tainted by the fact that the 6 is also pairing the turn, and so I'm not entirely sure if I should be betting, but I'm still doing the best that I can. And here he basically was operating from the same level where he thought something was happening, and he went with that. And it turned out that I couldn't range bet for quite a pot, and it turns out that he needs to be raising his hand quite frequently. Some other stuff that needs to raise, like all of these diamonds need to raise quite often. Then there's like some diamonds here that need to raise, which is kind of intuitive. Like these 10s, good luck finding those. A relatively tough strategy, and it will have a pretty big influence on the river. So we click call, and one thing to note, by the way, is that if I'm going with this mix, then my hand doesn't really want to bet, right? And for the same reason as it doesn't want to bet on the river, you just don't want to put an awful lot of money into the pot, or any money into the pot with a hand that doesn't really benefit from betting in equilibrium. Having said that, if you size down, you get pretty close to a check, and it doesn't really matter as much anymore. What I'm interested in doing in these situations is like, what if we do this? And then we see, well, now it's sort of okay. Like, probably ace-10 is still the hand that wants to bet least often, pretty much. Although like pocket 10s wants to check a bit more. Think about why that might happen, and give me the answers in the chat. In the comments, and I'll try to answer there what my thoughts are. But yeah, like you can see here, my hand doesn't really want to bet, but still it's fine if you just no block a bet here and you're not losing like a significant amount. So yeah, my hand doesn't really want to bet, but we're still betting it because we want simplicity. We are just going to go with this sim because I want him to operate as if I want the in-position player to operate as if it's just a normal bet that I'm making another range bet, because he doesn't know that I'm range betting the turn now. So we get a call here, and then the river was a blank-ish card, the blank of blanks. And you can see here, like a lot of hands just want to bet. Like if we go for flushes, 22% checks with flushes, which is something that you should find. If anything, I'd say that a lot of players are not going to find this. That would be my guess. And then my guess would be that pocket 10s wants to check if we have it. Yeah, so pocket 10s wants to check for same reasons or similar reasons why it wants to check on the turn. Assuming that either you've reacted now in the comments or you didn't, I'll tell you. I think it has to do with the fact that 10s blocks checkbacks. So it blocks the occasional 10x that is overbetting the flop and then is calling the turn. And then now on the river, on this deuce, if you check pocket 10s here, you make it less likely that villain has 10x, and 10x is always going to check back the river, I think, like you can see here. So these, pretty much always. These you all block, and so when you have two 10s, you make it a bit more likely that villain doesn't have any of these, but like the other part of the range, and so you're just getting more bets. Having said that, we are going to look at this, and yeah, we said, okay, if we have the top of the range, then we will need to check sometimes, but mostly we're betting. So like, yeah, like flush is obviously the most common one, and we are betting the like 27% of our range, and we're just betting more often than not. I could see I could see myself check versus some players. Bet versus some players, and just not really care too much about leaving my checking range overexposed, because in order to exploit me, you need to have like you need to, for instance, overcall the turn and bet really large on the river and stuff like that, and put me in all sorts of awkward spots. But versus this player, I think I would find some checks here. So with these, because I think he's just going to put me in tough spots. Anyway, you can see here he's supposed to bet 75% of the pot in equilibrium. But we'll play around with the river a little bit and see what happens if there's just like a few more combos that are betting and what would happen then. So we're just going to build a sub-tree, I think. All right, so nice. And then we'll make this into a 125 and 300. So that we can see if like 125 is used ever. A little bit, right? There's some all-ins. No, 3x this is actually. Yeah, so all-in, sorry, I was like fucking around a little bit. Like, so all-in is like 3x pot here. I saw 300% or roughly 300%, and I thought like it was like this bet sizing, but it's just all-in. And you can see it happens sometimes, right? But mostly it's actually a smaller bet size, which is a bit surprising to me. I will play around with it a little bit to see what happens if the out of position player just checks slightly weaker. One thing we can do is we can say, okay, let's say this happens. What should be happening? I should be folding. Like he's basically already making with an overbet. He's just already making a top pair indifferent here, and like the middle pairs are already slightly losing. So my call is definitely losing. And I think like if you'd ask me how do you feel about how you play this hand, I would say I'm not too happy about it. I think my opponent put me in some tough spots here, and I made some unforced errors. The flop is kind of like whatever. I probably should have folded, but yeah, like that's fine. I can live with overcalling the flop a little bit. Turn, kind of whatever, but yeah, like in hindsight, I would have just bet smaller. And now on the river here, could have just been more selective. And I don't think this guy's particularly going to massively overbluff, for instance, here, because he knows I'm going to find calls. I know he's going to find bluffs. And so you just end up in some sort of spot where you don't want to go too out of line here. And I think we kind of end up in a situation where we do go a bit out of line. Now, we don't really have ace 10 here. So we can, oh no, we can't actually at this point. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, so whatever. One thing that I want to do is here is node lock and just say that, let's say we are betting some more flushes, which I think, like if you're playing 50 and 0, 100 and 0 or something like that, you're just not going to see checks here with flushes. They're just going to scratch the back of their head and think, wow, flush is a very, very good hand. And generally the way I make money in poker is by betting very good hands. So they're not asking themselves, should I bet here? But how much should I bet? Like, is this a spot where I want to block bet and hopefully my opponent is going to raise, or should I just go and pick a non-greedy size of bet 75, or should I be greedy here and just go 2x over bet? Like, those are the thoughts that will be running through the average player's head here, and like to some extent that will be going through my head as well, right? I'm only human myself, so we'll just say like let's go with 10. Like we'll play around with it a little bit. So we're just going to say that there's less flushes now after checking, and we'll click go and we'll play around with it a little bit to see how that changes. So now you can see that the overbet becomes, you can see how sensitive this is, how fluid this is. We lowered the amount of flushes a touch, and now the imposition player just goes a lot bigger. Let's say we are removing them all, take like a very, I'm not saying that we should, right? But we just want to see what happens if. So we know that it's wrong because no one's always, the pool's never always checking their flushes always. There will always be a betting frequency. But just in case this happens, what is supposed to happen on the other side, and then you can see it just mostly goes all in and goes bananas, right? So yeah, very cool spot. I think my opponent played it better than I did. Like I credit where credit is due. I made some very sizable mistakes, like not like massive punts, but definitely some hands, some situations where I should have made a different decision, and my opponent like mostly played this fine. This is a fine overbet on the flop. It's a fine call on the turn, although you should mostly be raising this. And this is just going to be a GTO bluff on the river. Even in equilibrium, I'm assuming that this is just going to be always bluffing. At the very least, it's sometimes bluffing, right? So it's definitely not a mistake to be bluffing there. Whereas my call was kind of debatable. Yeah, so always bluffing and generating EV is a bluff. Again, my call is debatable here, but yeah, that's what you get when you're playing versus players that are putting you into tough spots. So kudos to my opponent. I hope you found this video somewhat useful. If you have any questions or comments, drop them down below, and talk to you guys soon. Bye.